Imagine if Zada Hedron Grinder were Jeskai. That's the elevator pitch for this deck. Hey there, I'm Adam. I've been playing Magic the Gathering for over a decade. This deck I'm about to present by far has the highest winning percentage of any commander deck I have ever built. At this point, I've played around a dozen games with it, and it's won at least 9 of those. So it's sitting at a win rate of about 75%, which is triple what you would expect your average commander deck to be pulling off. And that's despite this deck being bracket 2 and often having to come up against decks that are in bracket 3. Over the course of the years, I would always be looking through my binders and boxes, just generally looking for inspiration to build new decks. It's just something I like doing. And I kept coming across cards that looked like they would synergize well together, but I wasn't convinced to begin with that I had all of the pieces necessary to build a 100 card singleton deck with. And I also wasn't sure who the commander would be. The things that these cards had in common is that they were in red, white, and blue, and that there were a lot of cards that either cared about single target spells or just creatures that liked being targeted in general, and then a lot of low cost instants and sorceries that would not only target my creatures, but would also generate card advantage. And yeah, one of the cards that I did keep coming across was Zada Hedron Grinder. Now, I had a vague memory of coming up across a Zada deck once when I was building this deck. I knew I didn't want to build a mono-red deck for which Zada was the leader for a couple of reasons. First of all, I already had a mono-red deck and I just didn't want to have 2 of them. And second of all, I kind of liked the idea of widening the card pool and also seeing that that deck only plays out the one way. I also wanted to build a deck that felt like it played slightly differently in different games. Although, if I'm being completely honest, I feel like the real inspiration for this deck came from Mirrorwing Dragon. Mirrorwing Dragon is very similar. This costs 3 generic and double red for a dragon with power 4 and toughness 5. It has flying, and whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery that targets only this card, that player copies the spell for each other creature they control that the spell could target, and each copy targets a different one of those creatures. Now, what's fun about this is on your side of the battlefield, it functions the same way as Zada. But for your opponents, if they want to try to remove Mirrorwing Dragon with a targeted spell, they're going to remove all of their creatures in the process too. So I knew the colors and I knew the effects I wanted, and it wasn't until I'd accumulated more cards just by virtue of playing the game for a couple more years that I really felt like, okay, now's the time for me to build this deck. There was one legend in particular that I kept coming across in my binder that made me think, I wonder if this is the card that should be leading the deck. And that is Hinata Dawn-Crowned. Hinata Dawn-Crowned is a 4-mana Jeskai creature that's 1 blue, red, and white. It has 4 power, 4 toughness. It's a Keaton spirit with flying and trample. It has 2 passive abilities. One says spells you cast cost 1 mana less to cast for each target, and spells your opponents cast cost 1 more to cast for each target. Now, on the face of this card, Hinata looks like they want you to build around spells that target a lot of things. But that's not what we're trying to do here. Now, Hinata's discount ability is still useful for these kinds of effects. It's still going to discount those spells by 1 mana. But the strategy for this deck isn't to get Hinata out as soon as possible. We're only going to think about our commander more in the mid to late game. Instead, we're looking to establish a board of permanents, the majority of which are creatures, that will reward us for casting instants and sorceries that predominantly target a single body. The reward for casting spells that target those creatures can be broken down into the following groups. The aforementioned Zada and Mirrorwing Dragon are perhaps the best examples of creatures that we want to get on board to copy our spells. Cards like Beam Splitter Mage, Frontline Heroism, and Leyline of Resonance provide some form of redundancy to this type of effect. These cards are only going to copy our single target spells once rather than for each other creature we control, but this is still very handy in the deck. And in the case of those enchantments, those stack with the effects of Zada or Mirrorwing Dragon. Stormchaser Drake is the card that has exactly the kind of templating we're looking for here. It's a 2-mana creature, so we're going to get it down early, that draws you a card whenever it becomes the target of a spell. It doesn't matter if you've cast that spell or if it's the copy of a spell that's targeting it, you will draw a card. Both Emberheart Challenger and Illuminator Virtuoso have similar templating. 2-mana creatures that will either impulse draw or connive upon being targeted. Where they lose some of that raw card advantage that Stormchaser Drake has, they make up for it in getting stronger for each time they are targeted. And that's important in this deck because the ultimate way that you're going to take your opponents out is through swinging with your creatures. And it doesn't hurt to chip in some damage early. Yes, This deck is running Feather the Redeemed. It's also running Mavinda Student's Advocate. Cards like Young Pyromancer, Monastery Mentor, and Kaikar Wind's Fury are all going to reward you for casting your instants and sorceries by generating more creature tokens on the board for you. Remember that we're eventually trying to win with combat damage. The more creatures we have on board, the more useful effects like Zada or Mirrorwing Dragon will be. Cards like Orvar the Allform and Vesuvan Duplimancy are going to do you one better by generating you copies of creatures you control. Meanwhile, cards like Stormkiln Artist and Goldspan Dragon are going to generate treasure tokens for you when you're casting your many spells. Having those treasures is especially handy in this deck. It's just going to allow you to keep the deck going. This isn't strictly a Storm deck. There are no cards with the keyword Storm in this deck at all, but you are going to want to have some turns where you can chain together a few spells to really make the most of what this deck can do. Cards like Leonin Lightscribe and Stirring Hope Singer are going to buff your board every time you cast one of your spells. Once we've got enough creatures on board, we then start casting our single target spells. We also want these to be low cost, such that we can chain through quite a few of them. And we also want these to be cantrips, ideally, such that they can keep replacing themselves. Most of those cards are going to provide extra buffs to our creatures. Many of these cards only cost a single mana in the deck, but we're also not afraid to play 2 mana cantrips, because if they target a single creature, we know that we can always bring Hinata out onto the board to discount those cards by 50%, which feels kind of good. And the endgame plan for this deck, it does involve having Hinata out. To that end, this deck is running a number of X spells that target X creatures. With Hinata out, this essentially reduces the cost of X to 0, regardless of how many things you're targeting. So in practice, what does this mean? If we've got Hinata out, we can cast Heliod's Intervention for 2 mana and destroy every single artifact and enchantment that our opponents control. Or we can cast Aurelius Fury and tap every single creature our opponents control and stop all of our opponents from being able to cast non-creature spells this turn. Or we could just cast Distorting Wake for 3 mana and bounce every single non-land permanent our opponents control back to their hands. This is how we close games out. We're not too worried about what our opponents are doing with their board, because we know that in the late game, we're just going to be able to essentially ignore what's there and swing in with the board that we've built. Then there are some other X spells that do double duty. They can be used offensively to disable our opponent's entire boards, or they can be used defensively to protect our creatures should we be in a position where we're not yet ready to swing out for the win, but we know that we need to keep our board protected with the plan to swing out in the next turn or two. Cards like March of Swirling Mist, which is already a good card, is kind of broken in this deck. For 1 mana, if you've got Hinata out, you can phase out everything. You can use that to your advantage however the situation demands. Cards like Hide on the Ceiling and Disorder in the Court function very similarly in this regard. Bear in mind that this deck is aimed at bracket 2, which means we're not going ham in the lands department. I've also built this deck so it's not too expensive. It's sitting at a market value of around $200 US at the moment, and I don't really want to make it any more than that. Sometimes people have an adverse reaction to seeing Hinata in the command zone, and I think this is because it's sometimes built as a control or stacks deck. That's largely because of its last ability, which makes it harder for your opponents to cast spells that target. You could remove that last ability from this card, and I wouldn't change anything about this deck whatsoever. That said, it is nice that it provides some form of protection. Just be prepared to have the conversation with the people at your table and let them know that this is not that Hinata deck. I'm not looking to control or stacks you out. I'm just looking to kind of do fun things with my creatures. I think the reason why this deck has won so much when I think about it is because it looks relatively innocuous with the strategy as it's planned within the first 5 to 6 turns. And when you get to turn 7 or so, you're then usually in a position where you can just start chaining together a bunch of spells and usually push for a win. There's no combos in this deck, strictly speaking. What's fun about this deck is you're not really too worried about which exact pieces you get onto the board. The idea is just, let's get enough creatures onto the board that are going to reward me for the spells that I want to cast, that are going to make those creatures bigger, that are going to give me enough power to push for a win by attacking. There's redundancy and varied versions of effects in this deck. you can win without ever casting your commander or without ever drawing a Zada or the Mirrorwing Dragon. I would say getting to play one of those cards on board is probably going to increase your likelihood of winning, but you don't always need it. It's fun to be playing a few combat tricks in this deck as well. Most people don't see combat tricks coming in Commander, and, you know, catching someone out feels kind of sneaky good in the early game. As a side note, you could build a deck around Kaikar Wind's Fury that had a similar strategy to this one. My only caveat to that is that the end game cards that you put in this deck would end up being quite different. Because we're not reliant on Hinata's ability in the early game, it doesn't really matter who we run as the commander then. But in the late game, you want to make sure that your finishers synergize well with your commander and that you can make the most of the abilities that they have. So that's the deck. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you enjoy this kind of commander deck profile, leave me a comment and let me know. The more people who take an interest, the more likely I am to keep making these videos.